In September 2022, a historical action film called The Woman King was released. It's about an all-female African military division called the Agojie, and the story follows them as they fight for and protect the political and commercial interests of the Dahomey Kingdom of modern-day Benin in the 1800s. The premise was engaging, and the movie did pretty well in theaters. However, it did cause a newsworthy division among viewers, particularly regarding the Dahomey Kingdom's treatment of people they conquered and enslaved. There were people who enjoyed seeing this kind of story on screen and liked learning about the integral role that the Agojie played in making the Dahomey Kingdom one of the most powerful and prosperous states in West Africa, while others were frustrated that the film depicts the Agojie as a force for good who wanted to save slaves, when in reality, the Dahomey Kingdom, through their use of the Agojie, was one of the leading suppliers of slaves to African clients for the African slave trade, as well as European clients for the transatlantic slave trade. Naturally, after hearing these different perspectives on the film, one becomes curious about the real story behind such an interesting and controversial subject. So today, we're going to talk about the real story behind The Woman King. Most of what's known about the creation of the Agojie comes from oral accounts that have been passed down through the generations. According to oral history, King Baja started the force as a team of elephant hunters called Gebeto during his reign in the mid to late 1600s. Following the death of King Akaba of Dahomey in 1715, his twin sister Hangbe became ruler. During her reign, Queen Hangbe made the Agojie her royal guard, and with that, the Agojie were elevated to the role of the official protectors of the monarch. A few years later, in 1718, Hangbe's younger brother Agojie assumed the throne. From 1724 to 1727, King Agojie expanded the reaches of the Dahomey Kingdom, increasing its profits by taking captives from surrounding communities and selling them into the transatlantic slave trade, which had been going on for more than a century at that point. Many of these captives would be sent to the Americas, with the majority being sent specifically to Brazil and the Caribbean. In the late 1720s, Dahomey set its sights on a town called Save, the capital of the Waida Kingdom. Save was a particularly lucrative trade center, boasting French, Dutch, British, and Portuguese factories, as well as its own prosperous branch of the African slave trade. Dahomey saw the opportunity to expand its borders as well as take the commercial growth of Waida for themselves, and used the Agojie to conquer the trade town in 1727. The first written records of the Agojie were made in 1729, when European visitors likened them to the Greek Amazons of European mythology, and they have since been alternatively called the Dahomey Amazons. The Agojie reached their peak during the reign of King Gezo in the 1800s. Gezo made it his goal to invest more government funding into the military, and to also see that the Agojie were incorporated into Dahomey's main militia after previous wars and slave raids had left the kingdom's male population in massive decline. The all-female military was comprised of 5 divisions: artillerywomen, elephant hunters, musketeers, razorwomen, and archers. Every 3 years, a male court official was sent to travel across the kingdom, demanding that women and girls aged 15 to 34 join the army. The official age range for conscripts was meant to be 15 to 34. However, some were as young as 8 years old. Some recruits willingly volunteered, especially among young women who didn't want to get married and preferred to have a career in the military instead, while others were forcibly taken from both the kingdom's female slave population and local girls and women who were considered rebellious, or even as a punishment by their family for some infraction. In fact, it wasn't uncommon for a husband to punish an adulterous wife by sending her to become an Agojie. Oral tradition also maintains that the warriors in training were subjected to female circumcision. Apart from being put through extensive survival and endurance training, the warriors were also conditioned to have unbelievably high pain tolerance. And to withstand all of this bodily strain and trauma demanded massive amounts of mental discipline. Though the Agojie were supposed to be celibate, they were considered the king's third-class wives. It wasn't rare for them to become pregnant. For some, these pregnancies were consensual, but for many, they weren't. During this time, the Agojie style of military combat reached its most outstanding heights. Using the element of surprise, the warriors attacked villages around dawn, taking captives and decapitating those who resisted. They had also developed the skill of constructing underground tunnel systems that they used to execute complex stealth maneuvers. The construction of these tunnel systems made it possible for the Agojie to win entire battles without ever being seen by their opponents. Captives that were taken during raids were kept as slaves, with some being sold among Dahomey slaveholders, while others were sold to European clients and sent away to the Americas. In exchange, Dahomey received foreign weapons from the Europeans that they used in war to expand their kingdom's borders, absorbing even more regions into their realm. In addition to receiving more distinction with their incorporation into the kingdom's military, the Agojie were also active members of the royal cabinet and grand council, advising the monarch and attending to various government policies. The film The Woman King depicts the Dahomey kingdom in the early 1820s, around the time that the incorporation had occurred. The Dahomey kingdom was one of the leading slave trade states alongside the Oyo Empire of modern-day Nigeria. Back in 1748, the Oyo Empire had subjugated Dahomey and forced them into giving annual tribute to Oyo. In 1823, King Gezo had the Dahomey kingdom withdraw its forced allegiance from the Oyo Empire, ending Dahomey's tributary status. During that time, Gezo also changed the kingdom's chattel trade policy, deciding to only sell non-Dahomeyan slaves to Europeans and keep Dahomeyan slaves in the kingdom to provide the slave labor that maintained the kingdom's local infrastructure and agricultural industry. By the 1800s, slave populations that the West Africans had sold to the Americas had already had several revolts, with the French colony of Saint-Domingue, or Haiti as we call it today, being the first Caribbean colony in history to abolish slavery in 1793. In 1808, the British, having abolished slavery the year before, devised a campaign to apply pressure to the slave trade market in order to abolish slavery in various places on the African continent, as a way of appealing to changing moral attitudes about human subjugation and in order to aid the commercial transition to the Industrial Revolution, which had been funded by the profits made off of slave labor in the various colonies Great Britain owned in the Americas. This campaign is known as Great Britain's blockade of Africa. When the West Africans began to see a decrease in their exports and revenue following Great Britain's blockade, monarchs began to respond, and King Gezo was one of those monarchs. In the 1840s, King Gezo of Dahomey asserted, "The slave trade is the ruling principle of my people. It is the source and the glory of their wealth. The mother lulls the child to sleep with notes of triumph over an enemy, reduced to slavery." By the 1850s, Dahomey was already a very powerful kingdom that saw many foreigners visit and even immigrate there in search of opportunity. And people recorded their experiences observing Dahomeyan culture in general, as well as the Agojie specifically. One of the most notable ways these experiences were recorded was through art. This is a famous portrait of an Agojie military leader named Sedong Hongbe, drawn by British naval officer Frederick Forbes in 1851. It has served as being possibly the most famous portrait ever produced that depicts an Agojie warrior. In response to the pressure of Great Britain's blockade and changing attitude among his subjects in regard to slavery, King Gezo paused his participation in the transatlantic branch of the slave trade in 1852 before resuming it in 1857. King Gezo passed away in 1859, and it was over 40 years later, during the reign of King Behanzin, that the Agojie began to experience a decline as a result of the many casualties they suffered during various conflicts they participated in, especially conflicts with the French, Dahomey's former ally. Disagreements that Dahomey and France had over territorial control resulted in the First and Second Franco-Dahomeyan Wars. The Battle of Cana in 1894 brought Dahomey and France's territorial squabble to an end, with France emerging victorious and Dahomey suffering major losses. Only 60 out of the 1,200 Agojie who went to battle that day survived. Following the kingdom's defeat, Dahomey became a French protectorate and the Agojie was disbanded. Some of the retired warriors went on to marry and have families, and with that, the Agojie disappeared. Over the next 86 years, the Agojie remained little more than a nostalgic part of Benin's history, and many thought their chapter was closed, never to be opened again. That is, until 1978, when an interview was conducted with a woman who was believed to be the last surviving Agojie in history. Her name was Nawi, and she was interviewed by a local historian in Quinta, Benin, a district located over 100 miles north of Porto Novo, the nation's capital. Nawi detailed her memories of serving in the military and her experience fighting in the Second Franco-Dahomeyan War as a teenager. She died in November 1979, having lived to be over 100 years old. Her story caused a sensation. To this day, Nawi is remembered as the last Agojie, and she served as the inspiration behind the character Nawi in the film. The Agojie's history and renowned prestige in Beninese culture also influenced the American superhero comic series Black Panther, serving as the inspiration for the Dora Milaje, the all-female warriors of Wakanda that were created by Jimmy Palmiotti and Joe Quesada in the 1990s, and have since become a global phenomenon as some of the most memorable characters in the Marvel Universe. A 2019 documentary titled Warrior Women with Lupita Nyong'o presented a never-before-seen account on the true story of the Agojie, as a film crew follows Lupita, an actress who played a member of the Dora Milaje in the Black Panther films, as she travels across Benin to learn about the real warrior women who served as the inspiration behind her character. In the documentary, we get to see Lupita be guided through the courtyards of the royal palaces of Dahomey to attend an audience with the monarch and learn the truth behind who the Agojie really were, both good and bad. With the help of famed Beninese tour guide Martin de Sosa, who acts as her translator, Lupita even meets descendants of the Agojie who, after surviving the Battle of Cana, married and had families of their own. Lupita also has a heartbreaking meeting with the descendants of slaves that the Agojie had captured, and in the end, one finds that the kingdom of Dahomey, as well as its famed female warriors, were actually very, very complicated. Learning about the Agojie was an interesting experience for me. I found that these girls and women seemed to exist simultaneously as victims of the dreadful things their society did to them, and perpetrators of heinous acts of cruelty that they did in service of the very same society that used them. They were formidable military personnel, without a doubt, but are guilty of the same wrongs that other militaries throughout history have done. Researching the Agojie and the power of the Dahomey kingdom also made me think about the power that various other African kingdoms and empires have had over the course of history. In fact, the wealthiest man who has ever lived is Mansa Musa, who himself was an African emperor during the Middle Ages. African imperialism introduced plenty of technological and social advancements, just like all of the other empires that have existed throughout the centuries, and these changes came with human subjugation to benefit the imperial power. And from what I understand from studying these various empires, Africa has had a history of being guilty of selfish behavior in service of personal gain, just like everyone else. I also found myself thinking about the transatlantic slave trade and where it fit in the even larger African slave trade. People usually talk about the 400 years that Africans sold slaves to Europeans and stop the story there, as if this was the only time African kingdoms had ever exported human beings as chattel. We usually don't address the fact that Africans had already been selling slaves to Arabs for over 700 years before the transatlantic slave trade had even started, and had been selling slaves amongst themselves for over 1,000 years before that. Instead of talking about the entirety of human cruelty in African, nonetheless, world history, we focus on only one portion and ignore the rest. It seems like, in the name of correcting the intentional exclusion of African history from general academia, there is this habit of talking about African history and intentionally excluding the fact that African societies were capable of being prejudiced, operating with greed, and a desire to conquer others to suit their self-interest, just like everyone else. There seems to be this idea that Africans were somehow not capable of cruelty, and that if an instance was found where they were cruel, they were somehow not responsible for their actions, like, say, Asians or Europeans are. I think that this ideology is unrealistic because history is a record of human beings making decisions to suit self-interest. And there is no empire. And it doesn't matter if the empire in question is African, Asian, European, or American. None of them are immune to having the characteristics of greed and selfishness, or ingenuity and intelligence. Lastly, what left me most impressed during my research was watching Lupita Nyong'o listen to a family who descended from slaves of the Dahomey kingdom share their story and speak of their resolution to continue moving forward in life with forgiveness for what Dahomey had done to them. To forgive such cruelty takes a profound amount of self-mastery and moral fortitude. It's interesting that, in the end, the military that hurt their family can't hurt them anymore. And they are the ones who act as the keepers and teachers of the history of the very kingdom that their families were trafficked by. I found that family to be very inspiring and a true example of how humanity's capacity for good can overcome a lot of the messed up things we see in this world, if only we would respond wisely rather than react emotionally. In the end, the Agojie were complex. There were some things that one can commend them for, like their strength and intelligence. However, they are also guilty of causing a lot of pain and suffering to others in the pursuit of serving their government. And I think that this multifaceted reality is something we will find all over history, because that's how human nature is. It's complicated, and the point behind learning about these events is to provide us with the opportunity to learn from humanity's past mistakes. Otherwise, how else are we supposed to grow and do better? So, have you seen The Woman King? What did you think of the film? And what are your views about the Agojie's participation in the African slave trade? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and I'll see you next time.